The blood-red sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Creek as Theresa Gibson clutched the doctor's letter in her trembling hands, the diagnosis burning into her soul like a branding iron. Standing on the wooden boardwalk outside Dr. Holloway's office in the spring of 1878, she felt her dreams crumble to dust as surely as the parched earth beneath her boots. Theresa's honey-blonde hair, usually neatly pinned beneath her bonnet, had come loose in wisps that framed her tear-stained face. At 26, she'd endured more hardship than most women twice her age, but this news struck deeper than any tragedy before it. The words, irreparable damage and barrenness, swam before her eyes as she stumbled forward, unseeing. "Madam, you all right there?" The deep voice cut through her grief like a knife through butter. Theresa looked up, hastily wiping her tears with her sleeve, to find herself face to face with a tall man whose features were partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed Stetson. The stranger's concerned expression shifted to recognition as he took in her face. "Miss Gibson, didn't expect to see you out this late." He tipped his hat slightly, revealing piercing blue eyes set in a weathered face. It took her a moment to place him Jake Garrison, the new ranch hand at the neighboring Blackwater property. He'd arrived in Silver Creek, Colorado just 3 weeks prior, already stirring up gossip among the local women with his quiet manner and skilled horsemanship. "Mr. Garrison," Theresa nodded curtly, attempting to compose herself. "I'm perfectly fine. Thank you for your concern." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Jake studied her with eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade. "Begging your pardon, but you don't look fine." His gaze dropped to the crumpled paper in her hand, but he was gentleman enough not to pry further. "It's nothing," she insisted, tucking the letter into her pocket. "Just some disappointing news." Jake shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with her distress but unwilling to leave her alone in such a state. "I was just heading to the saloon for a meal. Would you allow me to escort you somewhere? Your home, perhaps?" Under normal circumstances, Theresa would have declined. A single woman walking with a bachelor at dusk was fodder enough for the town gossips. But tonight, the thought of returning to her empty house with its carefully prepared nursery that would never see use was unbearable. "The saloon serves decent stew on Tuesdays," she found herself saying, "and I could use something stronger than tea tonight." Jake's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise, but he offered his arm without comment. As they walked, Theresa became acutely aware of the whispers that followed them. Silver Creek wasn't large enough for secrets, and her monthly visits to Dr. Holloway had already set tongues wagging. The Silver Dollar Saloon was busy, but not rowdy when they entered. Jake guided her to a corner table, far from the piano player and the card games in progress. A few curious glances came their way, but Jake's imposing presence discouraged open gawking. After ordering stew and whiskey for them both, raising a few more eyebrows when Theresa didn't request tea instead, Jake leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes. "You know," he said finally, "sometimes telling your troubles to a stranger is easier than telling a friend. I'm heading out to the northern pastures tomorrow, won't be back in town for weeks. Your secrets would ride out with me." The offer was tempting. Theresa had kept her hopes and fears bottled up for so long, first during her brief tragic marriage to Thomas, then through 2 years of lonely widowhood. The women in town were kind but quick to gossip, and she'd learned to keep her own counsel. "Why would you care about a stranger's troubles, Mr. Garrison?" she asked, taking a small sip of whiskey and wincing at the burn. "Jake," he corrected, "and I've seen enough trouble myself to recognize when someone's carrying a heavy burden." The server brought their stew, and they ate in silence for several minutes. The simple food was comforting, and Theresa found her thoughts settling like silt in a stream bed. "I was married," she said finally, staring into her bowl. "His name was Thomas. He died in a mining accident 2 years ago, 3 months after our wedding." Jake nodded, his expression solemn. "I heard something about that. I'm sorry." What you probably didn't hear," she continued, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, "is that I was with child when he died." Jake's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully. "No. I hadn't heard that part. I lost the baby a week after they brought me Thomas's body." Theresa's hand unconsciously moved to her abdomen. "There were complications." Understanding dawned in Jake's eyes, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "I've been seeing Dr. Holloway since then, hoping—" Her voice cracked. "Today he confirmed what I've feared. The damage was too severe. I'll never have children." The words hung in the air between them, stark and final. Saying them aloud made the diagnosis real in a way that reading it on paper hadn't. "I'll never be a mother," she whispered, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. Jake reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. "Miss Gibson, Theresa, I'm truly sorry." The genuine compassion in his voice broke something loose inside her. Tears flowed freely now, though she made no sound. The patrons of the saloon tactfully avoided looking their way. "All my life," she said through her tears, "it's all I ever wanted. A home, a family of my own. Thomas and I had such plans." Jake pushed his empty bowl aside, leaning forward. "If you don't mind my asking, what will you do now?" The question brought Theresa up short. She'd been so focused on her grief that she hadn't thought beyond it. "I don't know," she admitted. "Continue teaching at the schoolhouse, I suppose. Live out my days as the town's spinster schoolmarm." The bitter edge to her voice surprised even her. "You're the schoolteacher?" Jake asked, seeming genuinely curious. "For the past year and a half. It was supposed to be temporary until—" She let the thought trail off. "I find I have a knack for it, though. The children are a joy, even if they're not." She couldn't finish. "Not your own," Jake supplied gently. "But you're still shaping lives. That's something not everyone can say." It was a kind sentiment, but cold comfort on this of all nights. Theresa drained the last of her whiskey, grimacing at the unfamiliar burn. "Thank you for listening, Mr. Garrison, Jake. As you predicted, it was easier telling a stranger." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "I should return home now." Jake stood quickly, dropping coins on the table to cover their meal. "I'll walk you." The night air had grown cooler, and Theresa was grateful for both her shawl and the solid presence of the cowboy beside her. They walked in comfortable silence through the darkening town, past closed shops and dimly lit windows. Silver Creek settled early, except for the saloon and the occasional late worker. As they approached her small house at the edge of town, a wedding gift from Thomas's parents that now stood as a monument to what might have been Theresa, felt a strange reluctance to say goodnight. "Would you care for some coffee?" she asked impulsively. "I have a fresh apple pie as well." Jake hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against kindness. "I shouldn't impose further on your evening." "Please," Theresa said, surprising herself with the urgency in her voice. "I don't think I can bear being alone with my thoughts just yet." After a moment's consideration, Jake nodded. "Coffee sounds fine, then." The small house was neat and modestly furnished. Theresa busied herself with the coffee pot while Jake removed his hat and looked around with interest. "You've made a nice home here," he observed. "Thank you." She gestured toward the kitchen table. "Please sit, the coffee won't take long." As she set out cups and cut generous slices of pie, Theresa found herself studying her unexpected guest. Jake Garrison was tall and broad-shouldered, as most working cowboys were, but there was a quiet grace to his movements that suggested education or good breeding. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, curling slightly at the collar of his worn but clean shirt. The lines around his eyes spoke of hardship and loss, but there was kindness there too. "How long have you been in Colorado?" she asked, bringing the coffee to the table. "About 6 months," he replied. "Worked a few ranches before signing on with Blackwater. Before that, I was in Wyoming, Montana for a spell, and Texas before that." "A true wanderer," Theresa observed. Jake's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Some might call it running. And what would you call it? He considered her question as he tasted the pie. Looking, maybe, though I couldn't tell you for what. There was something refreshingly honest about him, Theresa thought. No pretense or posturing. This pie is excellent, Jake said, changing the subject. Did you bake it yourself? I did. Cooking for one means plenty of leftovers, but I can't seem to scale down my mother's recipes. Lucky for me, he said with a genuine smile that transformed his serious face. They talked easily then about inconsequential things, the unseasonable warmth, the spring planting, town gossip that Jake had picked up despite his short time in Silver Creek. Theresa found herself laughing at his dry observations about some of the more colorful local characters. When the clock on the mantel chimed 10, Jake set down his empty cup with obvious reluctance. I should go. Early start tomorrow. Theresa nodded, suddenly aware of how improper it was to have a man in her home at this hour. Of course. Thank you again for your kindness tonight. At the door, Jake turned back, hat in hand. Miss Gibson, Theresa, what I said earlier about your teaching. I meant it. Some people spend their whole lives never touching another soul. You touch dozens every day. The unexpected words hit her like a physical blow. I thank you, she managed. Good night, Miss Gibson. With the tip of his hat, he was gone, melting into the darkness beyond her porch. Theresa closed the door, leaning against it as she listened to his footsteps fade away. For the first time since reading the doctor's letter, she felt something other than despair, a tiny spark of something she couldn't name. But that felt dangerously like hope. The following weeks passed in a haze of routine for Theresa. She taught her classes, attended church on Sundays, and gradually shared her diagnosis with a few close friends who offered sympathy and platitudes in equal measure. The pain dulled somewhat, transforming from a sharp, constant agony to a persistent ache that flared up at unexpected moments when a new mother brought her infant to town or when her students drew pictures of their families. True to his word, Jake Garrison had not returned to town. Theresa told herself she wasn't watching for him, wasn't listening for mentions of his name in conversations at the general store or post office. But a small part of her wondered if their unusual evening together had meant anything to him, or if she was merely another sad story he'd collected in his travels. Spring deepened into early summer, bringing with it unseasonable thunderstorms that swelled the creek beyond its banks. On a particularly violent night in early June, Theresa was awakened by pounding on her door. Wrapping herself in a robe, she hurried to answer, finding Sheriff Miller on her doorstep, rain dripping from his hat brim. Miss Gibson, sorry to wake you, but we need the schoolhouse as a shelter. The north end of town is flooding, and we're evacuating folks. Of course, Theresa said, instantly alert. Let me dress. I'll open it up right away. Within 20 minutes, Theresa had the schoolhouse lamps lit and was helping the first displaced families settle in. The rain continued to fall in sheets, and more townsfolk arrived as the night wore on, bringing what possessions they could carry. She was organizing bedding for the Hanson family when a commotion at the door drew her attention. Several men entered, supporting between them a mud-covered figure. With a jolt, Theresa recognized Jake Garrison, his face pale beneath the grime, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his thigh, dark with blood. Found him half a mile outside town, explained Ben Wheeler, one of the men helping him. Horse got spooked by lightning, threw him into Rock Creek. Lucky he didn't drown. Dr. Holloway, already attending to minor injuries among the evacuees, hurried over. Get him to that back table, he ordered. Theresa followed, her heart pounding inexplicably fast. Jake's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Up close, she could see that beyond the mud and the obvious leg injury, his face was bruised, a gash at his temple still oozing blood. Miss Gibson, I could use your assistance, Dr. Holloway said, cutting away Jake's sodden pant leg to reveal a deep laceration. I need hot water, clean cloths, and my bag from the corner. Grateful for a task to focus on, Theresa hurried to comply. As she worked alongside the doctor, cleaning instruments and holding bandages, Jake remained unconscious, flinching occasionally when the pain broke through his stupor. "Will he be all right?" she asked quietly, as Dr. Holloway finished stitching the wound. "If infection doesn't set in," the doctor replied, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The leg wound is nasty but clean. I'm more concerned about the head injury. He needs watching through the night." Theresa nodded. "I'll stay with him." Dr. Holloway gave her a shrewd look, but didn't comment on her eagerness to volunteer. "Check his pupils every hour. If they're uneven or if he becomes agitated, call me immediately." Left alone with Jake, Theresa pulled a chair close to his makeshift bed and settled in for her vigil. Around them, the schoolhouse hummed with subdued conversation as families prepared to weather the night. Someone had organized coffee and sandwiches, and a few children slept fitfully despite the storm that continued to rage outside. Sometime past midnight, Jake stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, he stared at the ceiling in confusion before his gaze found Theresa. "Miss Gibson." His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Try not to move," she instructed, leaning closer. "You've been injured." Jake winced as awareness of his pain returned. "The creek. It was flooded. My horse." "Your horse is fine," came a voice behind Theresa. She turned to see Ben Wheeler approaching with a cup of coffee. "Found her about 100 yards downstream from you, tangled in some brush but no worse for wear. She's at the livery now." Relief flashed across Jake's face. "Thank you." "Least I could do, seeing as you were heading back to warn us about the dam upstream giving way." Ben nodded at Theresa and moved off to help a new family entering the schoolhouse. "You were trying to warn the town?" Theresa asked, helping Jake take a sip of water. He grimaced as the movement jostled his injured leg. "Saw it happen. Was checking fence lines up that way when the storm hit. Old timber dam couldn't hold." His words were slurring slightly concerning Theresa. "You should rest now," she said. "We can talk more in the morning." Jake's eyes were already closing, but his hand found hers, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thought of you," he murmured so quietly she almost missed it. "When I was in the water. Thought I might not see you again." Before Theresa could respond, he had drifted back to unconsciousness, leaving her to wonder if the words had been meant for her or were simply the ramblings of a concussed mind. The rain stopped before dawn, and with first light came reports that the floodwaters were receding. Dr. Holloway returned to check on Jake, nodding with satisfaction at his improved color. "Fever's holding off so far," he pronounced, "but he shouldn't be moved for at least a few days. That leg needs time to start healing." "He can stay here," Theresa decided. With school dismissed for the summer, the building stood empty except for special events. By mid-morning, most of the displaced families had returned to assess damage to their homes. Theresa busied herself cleaning up the schoolhouse, washing bedding, and setting up a more comfortable pallet for Jake in the small room off the main classroom that served as her office. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the day. When lucid, he was a model patient, accepting water and broth without complaint, thanking Theresa for her care. In his fevered moments, which grew more frequent as the day wore on, he called out names she didn't recognize and once grasped her hand, mistaking her for someone named Sarah. By evening, Theresa was exhausted, but determined to see him through the night. Dr. Holloway, making a final check before returning to his other patients, frowned at the heat radiating from Jake's skin. "Infection's setting in," he said grimly. "I was afraid of this. The next 24 hours will tell." He left Theresa with instructions and medicines, promising to return in the morning. Alone again with Jake, she bathed his face with cool cloths and coaxed him to swallow the bitter medicine when he was conscious enough to do so. In the deepest part of the night, Jake's fever peaked. He thrashed against the bedding, muttering incoherently, occasionally crying out in what seemed to be terror. Theresa held his hand, speaking soothing words that she wasn't sure he could hear. "You're safe," she told him, wiping his brow with a damp cloth. "I'm here with you, Jake. You're going to be all right." Gradually, his agitation lessened. His eyes opened, clearer than they had been for hours, and fixed on her face. "Theresa," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You're still here." Relief washed over her. "Where else would I be?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Anyone ever tell you you're an angel?" She laughed softly, blinking back unexpected tears. "Hardly that." "My guardian angel, then," he insisted, his eyes already closing again. "Twice now you've saved me." "Twice?" she asked, but he was asleep once more, his breathing easier, the worst of the fever seemingly broken. By morning, Jake's fever had subsided significantly. Dr. Holloway pronounced himself cautiously optimistic, changing the dressings on Jake's leg and declaring the wound looked better than he dared hope. "You've done well by him, Miss Gibson," the doctor said as he prepared to leave. "Another day or two of rest, and he might be well enough to be moved to more suitable accommodations." The thought of Jake leaving brought an unexpected pang. Theresa had grown accustomed to his presence, to the rhythm of caring for him. "He's welcome to stay here as long as needed," she said. "It's no trouble." Dr. Holloway gave her a searching look. "Be that as it may, people will talk if he remains too long under your roof, even if it is the schoolhouse." Theresa felt her cheeks warm. "I hadn't considered that." "No reason you should have in an emergency," the doctor said kindly. "But Silver Creek has a long memory for scandal, deserved or not." After he left, Theresa sat beside Jake's pallet, contemplating the doctor's warning. Her reputation had always been above reproach and necessity for a schoolteacher, and the thought of gossip attaching itself to her name was unsettling. Yet when Jake woke, clear-eyed and alert for the first time since his injury, Theresa couldn't bring herself to mention moving him elsewhere. "How long have I been here?" he asked, accepting a cup of broth from her hands. 2 days, she answered, settling in the chair beside him. "How much do you remember?" Jake frowned in concentration. "The flood, trying to reach town to warn everyone. After that, it's mostly fragments." He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. "But I remember you were there through all of it. Someone had to make sure you didn't slip away in the night," she said lightly, "and I'm glad it was you." His gaze held hers steadily. "Thank you, Theresa." The use of her given name, spoken in that deep voice now free of fever's rasp, sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "You would have done the same for anyone," she said, rising abruptly. "Are you hungry? I could prepare something more substantial than broth." Jake seemed to sense her discomfort and didn't press. "Food would be welcome if it's not too much trouble." As she busied herself at the small stove in the corner, Theresa wondered at her reaction. It had been so long since she'd felt anything like attraction that she'd almost forgotten the sensation, the heightened awareness, the self-consciousness, the constant urge to touch. But this was madness, she told herself firmly. Jake Garrison was a drifter by his own admission, a man with no roots and no stated desire to put any down. And she was damaged, incomplete, not the kind of woman a man like him would want for anything more than passing companionship. She returned with a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of yesterday's stewed apples, setting it on the small table beside his pallet. "A feast," Jake declared, struggling to sit up straighter. "Here, let me help." Theresa adjusted his pillows, acutely aware of the solid warmth of his shoulders beneath her hands. "I've been meaning to ask," Jake said as he ate with obvious appetite. "What did I say while I was out of my head? I have a vague memory of talking quite a lot." Theresa hesitated. "Nothing too coherent. You called some names. Sarah was one. Family of yours?" A shadow crossed Jake's face. "My sister. She died in a cholera outbreak when we were young. I haven't thought of her in years." "I'm sorry," Theresa said softly. Jake shook his head as if to clear away the memory. "What else did I say? I have a feeling I might need to apologize for something." Theresa smiled despite herself. "You called me an angel, actually. Your guardian angel." "Well, that was true enough, fever or not," Jake said with a crooked smile. "You've been looking out for me since the moment we met." "Hardly," Theresa protested. If I recall correctly, you were the one comforting me that first night. And you've more than repaid that small kindness." Jake set aside his empty plate. "The way I see it, I now owe you a life debt." "Don't be ridiculous," Theresa said, busying herself with collecting his dishes. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Jake insisted. "Not with such care and patience." The earnestness in his voice made her look up, meeting his gaze. What she saw there, admiration, gratitude, and something warmer, made her breath catch. A knock at the schoolhouse door broke the moment. Grateful for the interruption, Theresa hurried to answer it, finding Mayor Clifford and his wife on the step. "Miss Gibson," the mayor greeted her, "we've come to inquire after Mr. Garrison's health. The whole town's talking about his heroic attempt to warn us about the dam." "He's much improved," Theresa replied, stepping aside to let them enter. "The fever's broken, and he's eating well." "Excellent news," boomed the mayor, making his way to Jake's bedside with his wife trailing behind. "Garrison, my good man, how are you feeling?" As the visitors exchanged pleasantries with Jake, Theresa excused herself to fetch coffee. In the main classroom, she took a moment to compose herself, unsettled by the intensity of the connection she'd felt with Jake moments before. "This cannot happen," she reminded herself sternly. Even if Jake felt the same inexplicable pull toward her, and that was a significant if, what future could they possibly have? A barren woman and a wandering cowboy were hardly the stuff of happily ever afters. Returning with coffee, she found Mayor Clifford in the midst of what appeared to be a proposition. "At least consider it," the mayor was saying. "Silver Creek would be fortunate to have a man of your caliber serving as deputy. Sheriff Miller isn't getting any younger, and with the railroad spur coming through next year, we'll need more law enforcement." Jake looked thoughtful. "It's a generous offer, Mr. Mayor, but I've never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots." "Perhaps it's time you did," suggested Mrs. Clifford, with a significant glance toward Theresa that made her cheeks burn. "At least promise to think about it," the mayor pressed. "The position would come with housing. That old Travis place at the edge of town could be fixed up nicely and a steady wage." "I'll consider it," Jake conceded, though he looked uncomfortable with the attention. After the Cliffords departed, an awkward silence fell between Jake and Theresa. She busied herself straightening the already tidy room, aware of his eyes following her movements. "Would you?" he asked finally. Theresa paused in her needless arranging of books. "Would I what?" "Think it's time I put down roots somewhere?" The question caught her off guard. "I hardly know you well enough to have an opinion on that." Jake smiled slightly. "I think you know me better than most, Theresa Gibson. You've seen me at my worst and weakest. Not many people can say that." There was truth in his words. In their brief acquaintance, they'd shared vulnerabilities that Theresa rarely exposed to anyone. Perhaps it was the very transience of their connection that had made such honesty possible, the belief that Jake would soon move on, taking her secrets with him as promised. But the mayor's offer changed that calculation. If Jake stayed in Silver Creek, became a part of the community, their relationship, whatever it was, would have to be defined differently. "If you're asking if I think Silver Creek is a good place to settle," she said carefully, "then yes, I do. It's a fine town with good people." "That's not what I'm asking, and you know it." Theresa met his gaze directly. "Then what are you asking, Mr. Garrison?" "Jake," he corrected automatically. "I'm asking if you'd mind if I stayed, if you'd prefer I move on once I'm healed." The blunt question demanded an equally honest answer. "I don't know," Theresa admitted. "When we met, you were a passing stranger who offered kindness when I needed it most. I never expected to see you again, let alone—" She gestured at their current situation. "And now?" Theresa sighed. "Now I find myself confused. You've become important to me in a very short time. But I'm not sure what that means or what you want it to mean." Jake shifted, wincing slightly as his injured leg protested the movement. "I'm not sure either," he confessed. "I haven't wanted to stay anywhere in a very long time. Not until I met you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, fraught with implications neither seemed ready to fully explore. "You should rest," Theresa said finally. Dr. Holloway will be by later to check your progress. Jake didn't press further, settling back against his pillows with a slight nod. We'll talk more when I'm on my feet again, he said, the words somewhere between a promise and a warning. Over the next few days, Jake's strength returned rapidly. By the end of the week, he was able to stand with assistance and take a few careful steps. Dr. Holloway pronounced him well enough to be moved, and arrangements were made for him to stay at the boarding house run by Mrs. Whitaker, a widow known for her discretion and excellent cooking. The morning of his departure from the schoolhouse, Theresa found herself unaccountably melancholy. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, his deep voice, his quiet observations, the way his face lit up when she brought fresh coffee. The schoolhouse would seem emptier without him. Sheriff Miller and his son arrived with a wagon to transport Jake, cushioned with quilts to make the short journey as comfortable as possible for his healing leg. As they helped him to the door, Jake paused, turning to Theresa. I never got to thank you properly, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. There's no need, Theresa insisted. Anyone would have. If you say anyone would have done the same one more time, I might just forget my manners entirely, Jake interrupted, a spark of humor in his eyes despite the gravity of his tone. What you did for me goes beyond simple kindness, Theresa. I won't forget it. Before she could respond, he leaned down, his lips brushing her cheek in the briefest of kisses. I'll see you soon, he promised, then allowed the sheriff to help him into the waiting wagon. Theresa stood on the schoolhouse steps long after the wagon had disappeared from view, her hand unconsciously touching the spot where his lips had pressed against her skin. True to his word, Jake called on her 3 days later. He arrived at her home in the early evening, walking with the aid of a cane, but otherwise much improved. Theresa invited him in for tea, hyper-aware of the curious glances from neighbors who happened to be outside when he arrived. Mrs. Whitaker's cooking lives up to its reputation, Jake said as they settled in her small parlor. But I find I miss your coffee. Theresa smiled despite her nervousness. High praise indeed. How's your leg healing? Well enough that Dr. Holloway says I can start looking for work soon, as long as it's not too strenuous at first. Jake hesitated, then added, I spoke with Mayor Clifford again yesterday. The deputy position is still available if I want it. And do you? Theresa asked, her heart beating a little faster. I'm considering it, Jake said carefully. It would be a change from what I'm used to, but not an unwelcome one. I've spent enough years sleeping under the stars to appreciate a roof that doesn't leak and walls that keep out the wind. Theresa nodded, waiting for him to continue, sensing there was more he wanted to say. There's just one thing I need to be sure of before I make a decision, Jake said, setting aside his teacup and leaning forward slightly. Theresa, I need to know if there's any chance at all, that you might someday see me as more than just the man you nursed back to health. The directness of the question took her breath away. Jake, before you answer, he interrupted, I should tell you something. That night we met, when you shared your heartbreak with me, I didn't tell you everything about myself. I've been married before. Theresa stilled. I see. Her name was Caroline. We were young, both 19. She died in childbirth, along with our son. The words came out evenly, but Theresa could see the cost of speaking them in the tightness around his eyes. That was 8 years ago. It's why I left Texas, why I started drifting. Nowhere felt like home after that. I'm so sorry, Theresa said softly, understanding now the shadows she'd glimpsed behind his eyes from the beginning. That's a terrible loss. Jake nodded. It was. For a long time I couldn't imagine ever wanting to build another life, to risk that kind of pain again. And now, Theresa asked, hardly daring to breathe, now I find myself thinking that some risks might be worth taking. Jake's gaze was steady, unwavering. If the person you'd be taking them with is the right one. Theresa's throat tightened with emotion. Jake? What happened to me, my condition, it doesn't just go away. If you're looking for a family, "I'm looking for you," he said simply. "The rest is details we can figure out together, if you're willing." The hope in his eyes was almost her undoing. "This is happening very fast," she said, trying to hold on to reason, even as her heart urged her to leap without looking. "I know," Jake acknowledged, "and I'm not asking for any promises today, just a chance to court you properly, to see if what I feel growing between us is something that could last." Put that way, it seemed like such a reasonable request, yet Theresa knew that agreeing would be setting them both on a path that could lead to either great joy or devastating heartbreak. "People will talk," she said, voicing one of her smaller concerns. Jake smiled slightly. "People always talk. Let them. I'm more interested in what you have to say." Theresa took a deep breath. "Yes." "Yes?" Jake repeated, as if uncertain he'd heard correctly. "Yes, I'll allow you to court me," Theresa clarified, a smile breaking through her serious expression, "though heaven knows what the town will make of it." Jake's answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I reckon they'll survive the shock." True to the prediction, Silver Creek buzzed with gossip when Jake Garrison began officially courting Theresa Gibson. Some approved of the match, seeing in it a neat solution to the town's spinster schoolmarm problem. Others clucked their tongues over the speed with which the relationship had developed, whispering behind their hands about what might have happened during those days Jake had spent recovering at the schoolhouse. Theresa held her head high through it all, finding unexpected strength in Jake's steady presence beside her. He accepted the position as deputy sheriff, moving into the small house the town provided and setting about repairing its neglected condition with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. Their courtship unfolded over the summer months in a series of small, perfect moments. Sunday afternoon picnics by the creek, where Jake taught Theresa to skip stones across the water, evening walks through town, their conversations ranging from childhood memories to favorite books to dreams deferred. Suppers at Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house, where the widow watched their growing affection with approving eyes. Jake proved to be a natural at law enforcement, his calm demeanor and fair judgment quickly earning the respect of even the most troublesome elements in Silver Creek. When the fall term began, he sometimes stopped by the schoolhouse at day's end to walk Theresa home, much to the delight of her students, who regarded the tall deputy with a mixture of awe and fascination. It was on one such afternoon in late September, with autumn painting the surrounding hills in vibrant golds and reds, that Jake asked Theresa to marry him. They had walked beyond the edge of town to a hilltop overlooking the valley, a spot they'd discovered during one of their Sunday excursions. "I know it hasn't been long," Jake said, taking her hands in his as they sat on a fallen log. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Theresa Gibson. Will you marry me?" Theresa looked into his earnest blue eyes, so different from the guarded gaze of the stranger she'd met that fateful evening outside the doctor's office. In the months since, she'd come to know the man behind those eyes, his quiet strength, his unexpected humor, the depth of his capacity for compassion. She'd fallen in love with him so gradually and yet so completely that she couldn't pinpoint when exactly it had happened. Yet even as joy bloomed in her heart at his proposal, the old fear surfaced the knowledge of what she couldn't give him. "Jake," she began hesitantly, "you know I can't have children. Are you certain that's a future you can accept? That 10 years from now, you won't look at me and regret choosing a woman who can't give you a family?" Jake's expression softened. "Theresa, when I look at you, I don't see what's missing. I see everything that's there, your kindness, your courage, your heart, that has room in it for every child who passes through your classroom. Those children adore you, and so do I." He squeezed her hands gently. "I've seen the way you are with your students, the patience you show Tommy Miller when he struggles with his letters, the extra time you spend with little Sarah Jenkins, because her mother is too busy with the new baby to help with her schoolwork. The way you make sure Billy Thompson has a decent lunch even though his father drinks away most of their money." Tears welled in Teresa's eyes at the evidence that Jake had noticed these small acts of care she performed almost unconsciously. "You've already healed more than you know," Jake continued, his voice gentle but certain. "And you've helped heal something in me, too, a part I thought was broken forever after Caroline died. Whether we have children of our own or not doesn't change the family we can be to each other, and maybe someday to a child who needs one." Teresa's heart swelled with emotion. "Yes," she whispered, a tear spilling down her cheek. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jake Garrison." Their wedding took place on a crisp November day, with the entire town turning out for the celebration. The church was decorated with late autumn flowers and evergreen boughs, and Mrs. Whitaker outdid herself with a reception feast that would be talked about for years to come. As Theresa stood beside Jake, repeating her vows in a clear, steady voice, she felt a sense of rightness, of coming home. The path that had brought them together had been marked by loss and pain for them both, but standing at its culmination, she could see how each step had been necessary to reach this moment. They moved into Jake's house, no longer the old Travis place, but now the Garrison home, which he had spent the autumn months transforming from a neglected bachelor's quarters to a comfortable dwelling worthy of his bride. The bedroom that might have been a nursery became instead a small library, filled with books they both loved and comfortable chairs for reading together in the evenings. Winter settled over Silver Creek, bringing with it the quiet intimacy of long nights and the discovery of married life's rhythms. Jake proved to be a considerate husband, patient and tender in ways that sometimes brought Theresa to tears with gratitude. In his arms, she found a healing she hadn't known she needed, the knowledge that she was desired and cherished completely, exactly as she was. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and with it came unexpected news that would change their lives once more. Dr. Holloway, examining Theresa for a persistent stomach ailment, sat back with a look of astonishment on his face. "Miss Gibson, Mrs. Garrison, I should say I hardly know how to tell you this, but it appears you're with child." Theresa stared at him in disbelief. "That's impossible. You told me yourself." "I told you what medical science indicated was almost certainly true," the doctor interrupted gently. "But medicine doesn't account for miracles, and I can't think of any other explanation. You're approximately 3 months along, by my estimation." Theresa left the doctor's office in a daze, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She had accepted her barrenness, had made peace with a future without children of her own. To have that certainty suddenly overturned was both exhilarating and terrifying. What if something went wrong? What if she lost this baby as she had lost her first? The thought was almost unbearable. She found Jake at the sheriff's office reviewing wanted posters with Sheriff Miller. One look at her face told him something momentous had happened. "Theresa, what is it?" he asked, immediately coming to her side. She couldn't find the words, could only shake her head mutely as tears filled her eyes. "Why don't you two use my office?" Sheriff Miller suggested tactfully, excusing himself with a nod. When they were alone, Jake led Theresa to a chair, kneeling before her with concern etched on his features. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," he promised. Theresa took a deep breath, finding her voice at last. "Dr. Holloway says I'm with child," she whispered, hardly daring to say the words aloud. Jake's expression transformed from concern to wonder. "A baby? But how?" "He called it a miracle," Theresa said, a tremulous smile breaking through her tears. "I'm afraid to believe it, Jake." After everything that happened before, Jake gathered her hands in his eyes shining with emotion. "Then I'll believe for both of us," he declared. "This child is a gift, Theresa. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The months that followed were a strange mixture of joy and anxiety for Theresa. Her body changed, growing round with the new life within her. The women of Silver Creek rallied around her, offering advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and casseroles for when she was too tired to cook. Jake was a rock through it all, his faith in a positive outcome never wavering even on the days when Theresa's fears threatened to overwhelm her. He massaged her aching feet in the evenings, built a cradle with his own hands, and read every book on childbirth he could find, determined to be as prepared as possible. As her due date approached, Theresa found herself thinking often of that night almost a year before, when she had whispered her deepest heartbreak to a kind stranger in a saloon corner. "I'll never be a mother," she had said, the words heavy with finality and despair. How wrong she had been, and how grateful she was for that fact. On a warm July evening in 1879, with Jake beside her and Dr. Holloway in attendance, Theresa gave birth to a healthy daughter. The labor was difficult but uncomplicated, each pain bringing her closer to the moment when she would finally hold her child. "She's perfect," Jake whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he cradled their daughter for the first time. "She has your eyes." Exhausted but radiant, Theresa reached out to touch the downy head of the infant Jake placed carefully in her arms. "Hello, little one," she murmured. "We've been waiting for you." They named her Sarah Caroline Garrison, honoring both Jake's sister and his first wife, in a gesture that acknowledged the past while embracing their future. The town celebrated her arrival with the same enthusiasm they had shown for Jake and Theresa's wedding, bringing gifts and good wishes to the new parents. Late one night, as Theresa nursed Sarah in the rocking chair Jake had made for them, she looked up to find her husband watching them with an expression of such tenderness it made her heart ache. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Jake crossed the room to kneel beside the chair, one hand gently stroking their daughter's back, the other finding Theresa's free hand to twine their fingers together. "I was thinking about the night we met," he admitted. "How lost you looked, how much pain was in your eyes when you told me you could never be a mother." Theresa nodded, remembering. "I was so certain then that my life would never include this," she said, glancing down at Sarah's peaceful face. "I couldn't see past my grief to any other possibility." "And I told you that you'd already healed more than you knew," Jake recalled. "I was right about that part, at least, though I had no idea how much more healing was in store for both of us." Theresa leaned down to press a kiss to his forehead, overwhelmed with gratitude for this man who had loved her through her darkest times and now shared in her greatest joy. "You saved me," she whispered, "not just by loving me, but by helping me see that my worth wasn't tied to whether I could have children." Jake shook his head. "We saved each other," he corrected, "and now we have Sarah and whatever other blessings might come our way." As if on cue, Sarah finished nursing and gave a contented sigh, her tiny hand flexing against Theresa's skin. Jake carefully took her, expertly positioning her against his shoulder to pat her back as he'd learned to do. Watching them, Theresa felt a completeness she had never dared to hope for after receiving that devastating diagnosis just over a year ago. Her path had led her through grief and loss, but also to this moment to a home filled with love, to a husband who saw her completely, to the daughter she had thought impossible. "I love you," she said simply. The words encompassing not just Jake and Sarah, but the life they had built together, the future stretching before them full of possibilities she was no longer afraid to embrace. Jake's smile was as warm and steady as his presence had been since that first fateful meeting. "And I love you, Theresa Garrison. Yesterday, today, and all the tomorrows we'll share." As Sarah drifted to sleep against her father's shoulder, Theresa rose from the rocking chair to stand beside them, completing their small circle. Outside, Silver Creek was quiet under the summer stars, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their growing love, and now the beginning of their family. Within the walls of the home they had made together, Theresa knew at last what it meant to be truly healed, not because her body had performed an unexpected miracle, but because her heart had found its way back to hope, to joy, and to love that would endure through whatever life brought their way.